The hands that fed God did not yet know it. Before the light came, before anyone else in the house had stirred, a young woman knelt in the dark over a heavy stone mill and ground barley into flour so that her children would have bread when they woke. Her name was Mary. The village was Nazareth in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, a little less than 2,000 years ago, and the boy asleep in the next room, the boy she fed every single morning on the cheapest grain in Galilee, would grow up to stand before thousands and say 5 words that split history in 2. I am the bread of life. But first, he was hungry. First, he was only a child at a poor table, fed by hands he did not yet understand. Listen to that house in the dark. The mill she turns is 2 heavy discs of basalt, hard, dark stone carried in from far away, because the pale limestone of this village is too soft to grind grain. The floor is cold. Last night's embers are almost dead, and the barley cracks into flour between her hands in the same slow circle as it has 1,000 mornings before. We remember Mary at the manger and at the cross. We almost never picture her here, grinding in the cold before dawn, feeding a household in a poor town in the hills of Galilee. This is the room the Gospels walk straight past. So this is the question we're going to answer carefully, using what Scripture tells us, what the ground of Nazareth has given up to archaeologists, and what we know of ordinary Galilean life in the 1st century. What was Jesus' table actually like? What did Mary set down, morning and evening, every single day? Step through the door with me. Mind the low beam. This is where he was raised. Let's start with what we can actually stand on, the ground itself. In 2009, archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority uncovered something remarkable in the middle of modern Nazareth. The remains of a small dwelling from the 1st century, the time of Jesus himself. It was a modest thing, a courtyard house built of the local limestone, with rooms opening onto a shared open space, cisterns cut down into the rock to catch the winter rain, and pits dug for storage. Nothing grand. Nothing a Roman would have looked at twice. This was a village of perhaps a few hundred people, farmers and craftsmen, clinging to a ridge above the Jezreel Valley. Notice the stone, because it matters for the table. Nazareth sits on soft limestone. You can carve it, but you cannot grind grain with it. And yet in these Galilean homes, archaeologists find hand mills made of hard, dark basalt. That basalt did not come from Nazareth. It was quarried elsewhere, near the Sea of Galilee and beyond, and traded in. So the very first tool of Mary's kitchen, the mill she knelt over before dawn, was an imported object in a poor house. A small sign that even the humblest table depended on a wider world of trade. And the soft limestone became something else in these homes. Cups, bowls, and jars carved from stone instead of clay, because under Jewish law, stone could not become ritually unclean. Hold on to those stone jars. We will meet them again, years later, at a wedding in Cana. And what kind of household was it, financially? Joseph was a tekton. We usually translate that word carpenter, but it's broader than that. A craftsman who worked in both wood and stone, a builder. That put the family in a particular place on the ladder. Not destitute, but not comfortable either. Margin, not misery. We can measure it, roughly. A day's wage for a working man in that world was a single denarius. Jesus himself would later use exactly that figure in a parable. 1 coin for 1 day to feed everyone under the roof. And over that thin income lay 2 layers of tax: the tribute owed to Rome and the levies of Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee. Every loaf on Mary's table was baked against that pressure. So set aside the picture we sometimes carry. a gentle, golden, comfortable Nazareth. The real place was small, hard, dusty in summer, cold in the dawn, and careful with every coin, which makes what happened at that table all the more worth seeing. So let's stop circling the house and step inside, because the real story of this family was never in its walls. It was on the table. Follow the food with me, from the first grind of grain in the dark to the last loaf broken at nightfall. It begins, as we saw, with barley. Not wheat, barley. Wheat made finer bread, but barley was cheaper. And in a house counting coins, barley was the daily grain. This is a small detail with a long shadow, and we'll come back to it. Mary ground it before light because fresh flour meant fresh bread, and bread was the center of everything. She would have baked it in or on a taben, a clay oven, the dough slapped against the hot inner wall or laid over the heat. Thin, round loaves, the smell of them rising into the house mixed with the smoke of olive wood. If you want to know the sound and smell of that home in the morning, it is this: stone grinding, fire crackling, barley bread baking. Bread was not a side dish. It was the meal, and it was the fork. There were no forks. A piece of bread, torn by hand, was what you used to scoop up everything else. And what was the everything else? A pot of lentils or chickpeas or beans, simmered slowly into a thick stew, sharpened with onion and garlic. Olive oil in nearly everything, for cooking, for dipping the bread, and later poured into a clay lamp to hold back the dark. There would be curds and soft goat's cheese. There would be fruit in its season and dried for the rest of the year. Figs, grapes, dates, raisins pressed into cakes. Now and then, salted fish carried up from the Sea of Galilee, a small luxury, not a daily thing. Wine, cut with water, at the table. And meat? Meat was rare, almost never on an ordinary day. Meat meant a feast, a lamb at Passover, a fattened animal for a wedding. For the rest of the year, the table was bread, oil, lentils, and whatever the season gave. But before any of it could be cooked, there was water. And water in Nazareth did not come from a tap, or even from a well in the courtyard. It came from a single spring at the edge of the village, the only reliable source for everyone in it. And so, every day, the women and girls of Nazareth walked down to that spring with heavy clay jars balanced on shoulder or hip, filled them, and carried them back up the slope, gallons of water, by hand, before the real work of the day could even begin. It was constant, back-breaking, and almost entirely women's labor. Mary walked that path thousands of times, and the well the village still points to today carries her name, a tradition, not a certainty, but one that remembers exactly who did this work. And she was not cooking for 2 or 3. The Gospels name Jesus' brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and speak of his sisters as well. That is a household of perhaps 8 mouths or more, all hungry, all growing. Every loaf multiplied. Every pot was stretched. The arithmetic of that kitchen was relentless, and it never once took a day off. Picture how they actually ate it. Not upright at a high table on chairs. That came later, in another world. They sat, or on special days reclined, on mats and cushions around a low table or a cloth spread on the floor. Everyone reached into a shared bowl in the center, each with their piece of bread. There's a moment at the Last Supper, years later, when Jesus hands a dipped piece of bread to Judas. And that gesture, the passing of a morsel from the common dish, is the oldest, most ordinary gesture of that Nazareth table, repeated on the darkest night of his life. And every meal began the same way. Before anyone ate, there was a blessing over the bread, an old Jewish prayer that thanks God, who brings bread out of the earth. It was said over that barley loaf every single day, which means something worth pausing on. When the grown Jesus takes bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and hands it out, at the feeding of the crowds, at the Last Supper, at a table in Emmaus after his resurrection, he is doing the exact thing he watched his mother and Joseph do 1,000 times over cheaper bread in a smaller room. The kitchen taught him the gesture before he gave it its meaning. And notice who is doing the work. In that world, the Father presided and spoke the blessing. But the food itself, the grinding, the baking, the stewing, the drawing of water, the serving, was Mary's, hour after hour, day after day. She fed everyone. And in a house like that, the one who cooks and serves is very often the one who eats last and least. There is no scene in the Gospels that shows us this. There didn't need to be. It was simply her life. Let me stop us right here, because you've been standing in this kitchen for a while now, and I want to ask you something directly. Someone fed you. Long before you could feed yourself, someone rose in the dark, or worked a long day, or went without, so that there would be something on the table when you were hungry. Maybe you thanked them. Maybe you never did. Maybe you never can now. When you were a child, the food simply appeared, the way it appeared for the boy in Nazareth, and you did not yet understand what it cost. So before we go on, tell me in the comments, who fed you? Whose hands, whose quiet work kept you alive before you knew to be grateful? I want to read them. Say their name. Because that question, the cost of daily provision, the fear of not having enough, sits at the very heart of this house. And at the heart of the prayer this boy would one day teach the world. Now let's move from the ordinary day to the day that was set apart. Because not every meal in Nazareth was the same. Once a week, everything changed. The Sabbath began on Friday as the sun went down, and Mary prepared for it in advance, because no work, including cooking, was done once it began. So the bread was baked ahead, the stew made ready, the house set in order while there was still light. Then the lamp was lit, that small clay dish of burning olive oil, and the day of rest came down over the household like a held breath. The Sabbath meal was not richer than the others. This was a poor house. There was no sudden abundance. What set it apart was not more food. It was rest. It was the blessing over bread and cup with the whole family gathered and nothing to rush toward. In a life measured by hard labor from dawn to dark, the holiness of that table was the holiness of stopping. The whole house was shaped by that faith, not just one day of it. The little case of Scripture fixed to the doorframe, touched coming in and going out. The words of the Shema, "Hear, O Israel," said over the children at rising and at rest. Faith here wasn't something the family did on the Sabbath. It was the air the kitchen breathed. The food itself carried the law into every meal. This was a kosher kitchen, though no one there would have needed the word. It was simply how a faithful home ate. Certain animals were never on the table at all. The pig, the shellfish, the birds of prey were not food, and never had been. Meat and milk were kept apart. When an animal was killed, its blood was drained out, because life belonged to God and was not to be eaten. And this is where those carved limestone vessels come back into the story. The stone jars and bowls that, unlike clay, could not become ritually unclean, standing ready in the corner so that water and food could be kept pure according to the law. Every choice in Mary's kitchen, down to the pot she reached for, was quietly shaped by a covenant older than the village itself. Cooking, here, was a form of obedience, and the year itself had a rhythm of feasts that pulled the family out of the village and toward Jerusalem. Passover in the spring, when the barley was ripe, the one time the household would eat lamb. Pentecost, at the wheat harvest. Tabernacles in the autumn, at the gathering of grapes and figs and olives. The table breathed with the seasons, fresh figs and grapes in late summer, everything dried and stored against the winter, the barley loaf the one constant through it all. There is a passage the boy would have learned that runs straight through this kitchen. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses describes the good land God was giving his people, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, of olive oil and honey, and tells them, "You will eat and be full and bless the Lord." Read that list again. It is not poetry about somewhere else. It is the menu of Mary's table, named 1,000 years before in the covenant itself. The stew, the bread, the oil, the figs, this was not just food, it was the promise of God, served daily in clay bowls. And a few lines before that, in the same passage, is a sentence this boy would carry his whole life. "Man does not live by bread alone," Moses says, "but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Hold on to that. The child learning those words over a barley loaf in Nazareth would one day, starving in the wilderness, say them back to the tempter, word for word. The table was his first classroom. The kitchen catechized the Messiah. But we should not romanticize even this, because daily bread, in a place like Nazareth, was never guaranteed. A late rain, a failed barley crop, a season of drought, a tax collector at the wrong moment, any one of these could turn a lean table into an empty one. And the scriptures the family read aloud were full of that memory. There was the story of a widow in a town called Zarephath, met by the prophet Elijah in a time of famine, down to her very last handful of flour and a little oil in the bottom of a jar, gathering sticks to bake what she believed would be the final meal for herself and her son before they starved. That was not a distant horror to a Galilean household. That was the thin edge everyone lived near, a handful of flour and a little oil. That was the whole distance between a family and hunger. And there was another story every child knew by heart. Ruth, a poor widow herself, walking behind the harvesters in a field of barley, gathering the stalks they left behind, because the law of Israel commanded that the corners of every field, and whatever the reapers dropped, be left for the poor and the stranger to glean. From that gleaned barley, she and the older woman she cared for survived. So the barley on Mary's table was tied, in the mind of every Israelite, to that ancient mercy, the command that the hungry must always be able to eat. When Mary set down the barley loaf, she was setting down bread that the law itself had fought to protect. Provision in that house was never merely economics. It was faith and memory and mercy, all baked into one cheap loaf. Now let's bring the Gospels themselves to the table, because there is exactly one scene where we see this Mary, Jesus' mother, at a feast, paying attention to food and drink. It is not in Nazareth. It is a wedding in a nearby village called Cana. The story is in the Gospel of John. There is a wedding, and the family is there. And something goes wrong that only a woman who has run a household her whole life would catch first. The wine has run out. In that culture, for a host, this was a humiliation. And it is Mary who notices, and Mary who acts. She turns to her son and simply lays the problem in front of him. When the servants hesitate, she gives them the last instruction we ever hear from her lips in all of Scripture. Do whatever he tells you. 4 words. And then she steps back, and the water in those stone purification jars, the very kind of jars from her own village, becomes wine. It is the first sign, John says, that Jesus performed. And it happens because his mother was watching the table, the way she had watched every table for 30 years. There is something almost unbearably tender in that. For 30 years she had been the one making sure there was enough, and quietly carrying the shame when there wasn't. At Cana, that instinct did not switch off, but this time, instead of solving the empty cup herself, she turned to her son. The mother who had provided for him his whole life turned, at last, to be provided for. The very first miracle flowed out of a mother's eye for an empty table. We have to be careful here, because there is another Mary in the Gospels often pictured cooking, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, in the scene where Martha is busy in the kitchen. That is a different woman entirely, in a different town, years later. She is not Jesus' mother. To meet Mary of Nazareth at a table, Cana is the one place we truly can. And then there is the bread itself, following the boy into his ministry. When enormous crowds are hungry and there is nothing to feed them, a boy in the crowd has 5 small loaves, and John tells us exactly what they were made of. Barley, the bread of the poor, the same cheap grain Mary ground before dawn. From those 5 barley loaves, thousands are fed. And the very next day, when the crowd comes looking for more bread, Jesus says the words this whole story has been reaching toward. I am the bread of life. The one who was fed every day on the humblest bread in Galilee now offers himself under exactly that image. He did not reach for gold or wine or the food of kings. He reached for the barley loaf from his mother's table and made it mean everything. But there is one more thing about that table, and it is the strangest of all. A pattern too large to be an accident, running from before his birth to the far side of his grave. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. He was born in a town called Bethlehem. In Hebrew, Bethlehem means, quite literally, house of bread. And in that house of bread, the newborn was laid, Luke tells us plainly, in a manger. A manger is not a cradle. It is a feeding trough, the place where animals come to eat. The child who would call himself the bread of life was born in the house of bread and laid down where food is placed. Now, we should be honest about what kind of claim that is. The meaning of the name is simple fact. Whether God intended the poetry of it is a matter of faith, not proof. This is something the believing heart sees, not something a historian can measure. But once you have stood in Mary's kitchen, it is very hard to unsee. And the pattern goes back further still, to the wilderness centuries before, when God fed his people with bread from heaven each morning. Manna, just enough for the day, never more. That was the ancient picture. Daily bread, given by God, gathered at dawn. And here, in Nazareth, is a boy receiving daily bread, gathered at dawn, given through the hands of his mother. When he grows up and says the bread from heaven has come at last, that he himself is the living bread, he is not inventing a new image. He is fulfilling the oldest one, the one his own breakfast had been quietly rehearsing his entire life. Which brings us to a prayer you may know by heart. When his followers asked him how to pray, near the center of the words he gave them was a single, ordinary request. Give us this day our daily bread. We say it lightly, but it came from a man who knew exactly what daily bread cost, who had watched a woman grind it in the dark, who knew the difference between a full barley harvest and a lean one, who understood that daily bread was not a metaphor, but a real and sometimes uncertain thing. That petition was born in a Nazareth kitchen before it was ever prayed in a cathedral. So what happened to that table? Where does the story end? It ends, strangely and beautifully, with Jesus doing his mother's work. After the resurrection, John tells us, the disciples come in from a night of fishing on the Sea of Galilee, cold and empty-handed, and they see a figure on the shore in the gray dawn. He has already lit a charcoal fire. He has fish laid on it, and bread. And he says to them simply, "Come and have breakfast." The risen Lord of heaven and earth, on the far side of the grave, is doing exactly what Mary did every morning of his childhood, rising early, making a fire, preparing fish and bread, and calling the family to the table to eat. The one who was fed had become the one who feeds. And notice where it happens. On the shore of the very lake whose salted fish had been a rare treat at his childhood table. The boy who once ate Galilean fish only now and then, as a small luxury the household could seldom afford, now grills it freely at dawn for his friends. There is a whole life folded into that little fire. Every evening meal Mary ever made, the fish laid out, the bread broken, the family called in from the fading light, was, though no one could have known it, a rehearsal for this morning. The gestures of a poor Nazareth kitchen had become the gestures of resurrection. If you want to know what Jesus' table was like in Nazareth, look hard at that beach. He is doing exactly what he watched being done at home, all his childhood, making sure the people he loves are fed before anything else is said. And on the same day, on a road to a village called Emmaus, two heartbroken travelers walk with a stranger they do not recognize, and only at the table, when he takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and gives it to them, that gesture, that same old gesture from Nazareth, do their eyes open, and they know him. He was known, in the end, in the breaking of bread. Think for a moment about what a neighbor would have seen through all those Nazareth years. A woman in a poor house, grinding barley before dawn, hauling water up the slope, feeding a crowd of children, serving everyone and eating last. One more Galilean mother among hundreds, doing what mothers did, unremarkable and unrecorded. If you had lived next door, you would have had no reason to look twice. You could not have known that the boy tearing his bread at that low table would be spoken of 2,000 years later, on the far side of a world she never imagined. That is the quiet scandal at the center of this whole story. That God chose to be raised not in a palace kitchen, but in an ordinary one, fed by ordinary hands, on the cheapest bread in Galilee, and that no one watching could tell. And maybe that is the part meant to stop you. Because if the holy could hide itself that completely inside one poor woman's daily work, then perhaps it is hiding, still inside yours, inside the unglamorous, unseen, endlessly repeated labor of feeding and caring that no one writes down and everyone depends on. And the village still stands. Beneath the modern town, archaeologists are still lifting those first-century stones back into the light. The cisterns, the storage pits, the walls of houses like the one where a boy grew strong on barley bread. The ordinary ground where the extraordinary was quietly fed. So let me leave you where we began, before the light at the mill. The next time you sit down to eat, however plain the meal, remember that the Lord of that table began at one exactly like it. He knew hunger and provision, the smell of baking bread and the cost of it, the mother who served and ate last. And the next time you pray those 4 small words, "Give us this day our daily bread," know that you are praying the bread of Nazareth. Ordinary, daily, made by love you may not yet fully understand, given still by the hands of God. If this opened that ancient table for you, and you know someone who needs to be reminded that the holy hides inside the ordinary, a tired parent, a friend who feels unseen in their daily work, share this with them today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so we can keep walking together back into these first-century days, one story at a time. And before you go, tell me one last thing in the comments. What is the simplest meal you remember from your childhood? The one that, looking back, tasted like being loved? I'll be reading. Say it out loud.